Chapter 7. The Angles and Saxons in the Middle Ages. From the time of the first permanent hold of the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles on British soil until they really possessed the land was about 150 years. The Jutes possessed Kent. These were the fewest of the three peoples, and therefore occupied the smallest portion of the land. Their dominions took in only Kent, with perhaps for a while Surrey, and the Isle of Wight, with a small part of the neighboring mainland of Hampshire, and the kingdom of the Jutes never permanently outgrew the bounds of their earliest conquests. On all sides of the Jutes landward dwelt the Saxons. South and west were the South Saxons, from whom the land held by them derived the abbreviated name Sussex, and from that Sussex, which it has ever since borne. West of these, but more inland, dwelt the West Saxons, whose kingdom was called Wessex. North of Kent dwelt the East Saxons, their kingdom and land called forever Essex. And between the East Saxons and the West Saxons, between Essex and Wessex, dwelt the Middle Saxons, their kingdom and land called forever Middlesex. The Angles held all the land north of Essex, Middlesex, and Wessex to the Firth of Forth. In the peninsula immediately north of Essex dwelt the East Angles, their kingdom and country called East Anglia. Those in the northern part of the peninsula were called Northfolk, and those in the southern part Southfolk, from which the descent through Norfolk and Southfolk come the names that still remain, Norfolk and Suffolk. West of these dwelt the South Angles, immediately north of these the Mid-Angles reaching to the river Humber. From the Humber to the Firth of Forth the land was divided by the Angles into two almost equal portions, the southern of which was the kingdom of Deira, and the northern the kingdom of Bernicia. The territory between Wales and Mid and South Anglia, being the border, was at first a mark or march, from which it became Marcia and Mercia. Its Anglican inhabitants were called Mercians, and their kingdom Mercia, which also included the Mid and South Angles. The kingdom of the Jutes was established in Kent in A.D. 475, that of the South Saxons in 491, that of the West Saxons in 519, that of the East Saxons about 525, and by 552 the Angles had made the conquest of their part of Middle Britain to the march or border. This pressure of the Angles in mid-Britain enabled the South Saxons to push their conquests further inland. In 552 their capture of the hill fort of Old Sarum threw open the reaches of the Wiltshire Downs, and a march of King Cuthwolf on the Thames made them masters in 571 of the districts which now form Oxfordshire and Berkshire. Pushing along the upper valley of Avon to a new battle of Barbary Hill, they swooped at last from their uplands on the rich prey that lay along the Severn. Gloucester, Cirencester, and Bath, cities which had leagued under their British kings to resist this onset, became in 577 the spoil of an English victory at Diorum, and the line of the Great Western River lay open to the arms of the conquerors. With the victory of Diorum, the conquest of the bulk of Britain was complete. Eastward of a line which may be roughly drawn along the moorlands of Northumberland and Yorkshire, through Derbyshire and the forest of Arden to the lower Severn, and thence by Mendip to the sea, the island had passed into English hands. Britain had in the main become England, and within this New England a Teutonic society was settled on the wreck of Rome. So far as the conquest had yet gone, it had been complete. Not a Briton remained as subject or slave on English ground. Sullenly, inch by inch, the beaten men drew back from the land which their conquerors had won, and eastward of a border line which the English sword had drawn, All was now purely English. It is this which distinguishes the conquest of Britain from that of the other provinces of Rome. The conquest of Gaul by the Franks, or of Italy by the Lombards, proved little more than a forcible settlement of the one or the other among tributary subjects who were destined in the long course of ages to absorb their conquerors. French is the tongue not of the Frank, but of the Gaul whom he overcame, and the fair hair of the Lombard is all but unknown in Lombardy. But the English conquest of Britain up to the point which we have reached was a sheer dispossession of the people whom the English conquered. It was not that Englishmen, fierce and cruel as at times they seem to have been, were more fierce or more cruel than other Germans who attacked the empire. What really made the difference between the fate of Britain and that of the rest of the Roman world was the stubborn courage of the British themselves. In all the worldwide struggles between Rome and the German peoples, no land was so stubbornly fought for or so hardly won. In Gaul, no native resistance met Frank or Visigoth, save from the brave peasants of Brittany and Auvergne. No popular revolt broke out against the rule of Odoacer or Theodoric in Italy, but in Britain the invader was met by a courage almost equal to his own. Instead of quartering themselves quietly, like their fellows abroad, on subjects who were glad to buy peace by obedience and tribute, the English had to make every inch of Britain their own by hard fighting. What strikes us at once in the New England is this, that it was the one purely German nation that rose upon the wreck of Rome. In other lands, in Spain or Gaul or Italy, though they were equally conquered by German peoples, religion, social life, administrative order still remained Roman. Britain was almost the only province of the empire where Rome died into a vague tradition of the past. The whole organization of government and society disappeared with the people who used it. The settlement of the English in the conquered land was nothing less than an absolute transfer of English society in its completest form to the soil of Britain. The slowness of their advance, the small numbers of each separate band in its descent upon the coast, made it possible for the settlers to bring with them, or to call to them when their work was done, the wives and children, the late enslaved, even the cattle they had left behind them. The first wave of conquest was but the prelude to the gradual migration of a whole people. It was England which settled down on British soil, England with its own language, its own laws, its complete social fabric, its system of village life and village culture, its township and its hundred, its principle of kinship, its principle of representation. It was not as mere pirates or stray war bands, but as peoples already made and fitted by a common temper and common customs to draw together into our English nation in the days to come, that our fathers left their homeland. Of the three peoples, the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles occupied a much larger portion of the land than did both the others, and so their name gave a new name to the land to which they had come, Angleland, England, while as to the kingdom itself, it was Wessex that grew into England and her house of Cerdic that became the royal house over the whole land. However, this matter of one royal house over the whole land is another long story in addition to that of these three peoples taking possession of the land. For though all spoke the same language and used the same laws, and though all were bent on winning the same land, each band and each leader preferred their own separate course of action to any collective enterprise. This spirit caused them, though only three distinct peoples, to form themselves in the occupancy of the land into no less than 8 distinct kingdoms. And no sooner were ended their wars with the Britons, that they might in quietness inhabit the land, than they began as desperate a struggle among themselves for the supremacy and the sole kingship of all England. Thus in AD 597, there were in England the 8 distinct kingdoms of Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, Mercia, East Anglia, Deira, and Bernicia. Each kingdom was the result of the union of smaller divisions called shires, their chiefs bearing the title of ealdorman or alderman in peace, of hertoge or herzog in time of war. The union of shires formed a rice or kingdom. The chief of the group thus formed was a cyning or king. What, it may be asked, was the difference between king and ealdorman? The ealdorman was a ruler in peace and a captain in war. The king was more. Among the English, at least, the kingly houses all claimed descent from the blood of the gods. Every king was a son of Woden. A vague religious reverence thus gathered round the king in which the ealdorman had no share. He was also the head of the highest political aggregate which the ideas of those days had reached. He was, as the name implies, the head of the kin, the nation. The rule of the ealdorman was tribal and merely earthly. The rule of the king was national, and in some sort divine. Of the community, there were 3 classes: Earls, Churls, and Thralls. The Earls were a class who by distinction of birth were held to be entitled to special respect and honor, and who, because of this, possessed certain political privileges. The Churls were freemen, but had no honors or privileges above those of the general community. The Thralls were slaves held in bondage or thraldom. The Earl, the Churl, and the Thrall are found everywhere. They are taken for granted, and legend represented the 3 classes as called into being by separate acts of the creative power of the gods. In AD 605, Ethelfrith, king of Bernicia, seized the kingdom of Deira, and as this gave them to all East Britain north of the river Humber, the enlarged kingdom thus formed was called Northumbria. Ethelfrith also made the complete conquest of the greater part of the land that was yet held by the Britons westward to the Irish Sea between the Firth of Clyde and the mouths of the Mersey and the Dee. This reduced the number of English kingdoms to 7, and it is this that is the ground upon which writers treat the history of that time under the title of the Saxon Heptarchy. When Ethelfrith seized Deira, Edwin, its rightful king, being but a child, fled to East Anglia, where he was protected by King Radwald. This served Ethelfrith as a pretext for an attempt to subdue that kingdom. He was vigorously resisted, and at the river Idle by Retford he was defeated and slain. Upon the death of Ethelfrith, the people of Deira were glad to have Edwin return to his kingdom. By the conquest of Bernicia, Edwin reestablished and made permanent the union of Bernicia and Deira that Ethelfrith had formed. The greatness of Northumbria now reached its height. Within his own dominions, Edwin displayed a genius for civil government which shows how utterly the mere age of conquest had passed away. With him began the English proverb so often applied to after-kings: "A woman with her babe might walk scatheless from sea to sea in Edwin's day." Peaceful communication revived along the deserted highways. The springs by the roadside were marked with stakes, and a cup of brass was set beside each for the traveler's refreshment. The Northumbrian king became, in fact, supreme over Britain, as no king of English blood had been before. Northward his kingdom reached to the Firth of Forth, and here, if we may trust tradition, Edwin formed a city which bore his name, Edinburgh, Edwin's Burg. To the west his arms crushed the long resistance of Elmet, the district about Leeds. He was master of Chester, and the fleet he equipped there subdued the isles of Anglesey and Man. South of the Umbria, he was owned as overlord by the 5 English states of mid-Britain. The West Saxons remained for a while independent, but they too were at last obliged to acknowledge the overlordship of Northumbria. And Kent had bound itself to him by giving him its king's daughter as a wife, a step which probably marked political subordination. At this time Penda was king of Mercia, and the other kingdoms of Mid-Britain recognized his overlordship, as he in turn recognized the overlordship of Edwin. In 633 Penda formed an alliance with a Welsh king, Cadwallon, to break the power of Edwin. The armies met in 633 at a place called Hathfeld, and in the fight Edwin was defeated and slain. Bernicia at once seized on the fall of Edwin to recall the line of Ethelfrith to its throne, and after a year of anarchy his second son, Oswald, became its king. The Welsh had remained encamped in the heart of the north, and Oswald's first fight was with Cadwallon. The forces met in 635 near the Roman wall. Cadwallon fell fighting on the Heaven's Field, as after times called the field of battle. The submission of the kingdom of Deira to the Conqueror restored the kingdom of Northumbria, and for 9 years the power of Oswald equaled that of Edwin. Oswald's lordship stretched as widely over Britain as that of his predecessor Edwin. In him, even more than in Edwin, men saw some faint likeness of the older emperors. Once, indeed, a writer from the land of the Picts calls Oswald emperor of the whole of Britain. In 642 Oswald led his army into East Anglia to deliver that kingdom from the terrible rule of Penda, king of Mercia. The battle was fought at Masterfeld. Oswald was defeated and slain, and for 13 years Penda stood supreme in Britain. Oswu, younger brother of Oswald, succeeded to the kingship of Northumbria. In 655 the Northumbrians again met Penda in the field of Windward by Leeds. Penda was slain, and because of a great rain which swelled the river over which the Mercians must flee, only a remnant of them escaped. And Northumbria under Oswu stood to England as it had under Edwin and Oswald. It so continued under Egfrith, who succeeded Oswu in 670, and whose reign marks the highest pitch of Northumbrian power. Egfrith in 685 carried an expedition against the Picts, but was slain, and his army was annihilated in a battle at Fife. This delivered the central and southern kingdoms from the domination of Northumbria. Mercia immediately regained her full power over all mid-Britain, while Wessex, under Ine from 688 to 714, gained full power over all Britain south of the Thames, and Ine's repulse of a new Mercian king in a bloody encounter at Woodnesburth in 714 seemed to establish the threefold division of the English race between three realms of almost equal power, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex. However, Ine in 726 made a pilgrimage to Rome. In his absence, anarchy reigned in Wessex. In this, Ethelbald, the Mercian king, saw his opportunity. He penetrated to the very heart of the West Saxon kingdom, and his siege and capture of the royal town of Somerton in 733 ended the war. For 20 years the overlordship of Mercia was recognized by all Britain south of the Humber. And since at this time anarchy reigned in Northumbria, the kingdom of Mercia became fairly the kingdom of England. This, however, was for only a short time, for in a desperate battle at Burford in 753, a decided victory freed Wessex from the Mercian yoke. 4 years later, in 757, its freedom was maintained by a new victory at Secandum. Wessex had regained independence, but that was all. For Ethelbald, who was slain in the battle of Secandum, was immediately succeeded by Offa, under whose long reign, 757 to 796, Mercia rose again to all but its old dominion. Offa's is the greatest name in Mercian history, and his position was as great as that of any English king before the final union of the kingdoms. In one way it was higher than that of any of them. Offa held not only a British, but a European position. This because the mighty Charlemagne corresponded with him as with an equal. This was before Charlemagne was made emperor by the Pope, and when he manifested a disposition to treat the king of Mercia as less than an equal, war was threatened between them. And after Charlemagne became emperor of Rome, Cenwulf, Offa's successor, 797 to 819, put it clearly on record that neither the Bishop of Rome nor the Emperor of Rome had any jurisdiction in his realm of Mercia. By this time Wessex had so well employed her independence as not only to have regained, but enlarged and firmly established her power over all Britain south of the Thames. This Mercia was compelled to recognize, and Cenwulf could only preserve the immediate realm of Mercia as he received it. Thus, at the close of the 8th century, the drift of the English peoples toward a national unity was in fact utterly arrested. The work of Northumbria had been foiled by the resistance of Mercia. The effort of Mercia had broken down before the resistance of Wessex. A threefold division seemed to have stamped itself upon the land, and so complete was the balance of power between the three realms which parted it, that no subjection of one to the other seemed likely to fuse the English tribes into an English people. Yet at this very time there were taking shape in Wessex the elements which presently developed a mighty impulse toward a national unity, and which in the former part of the 10th century, with but slight checks meanwhile, culminated in the actual union of all England under only one king. Among the rival claimants of the kingship of Wessex, after the regaining of her independence in 757, was a certain Ecgbert or Egbert. The king who was elected in 786 sought to kill him, and he was compelled to flee the kingdom entirely. He first took refuge with Offa. The king of Wessex demanded that he be surrendered. Offa refused, but as he could no longer harbor Egbert without bringing into his own affairs continual trouble, he declined to assure him further protection. Then Egbert escaped to the continent, and in 787 found refuge at the court of Charlemagne. There he went to Charlemagne's school in more senses of the word than one. In the year 800, Edburga, the wife of the king of Wessex, prepared a poisoned drink for a young friend of her husband's, but both he and her husband drank of it, and both died. Then Edburga, being obliged to flee, likewise took refuge at the court of Charlemagne. Her coming there brought to Egbert the information that the throne of Wessex was vacant. He immediately returned to Wessex, and was promptly chosen to the kingship. The day of Northumberland and the day of Mercia had passed. The day of Wessex had come. The single reign of Egbert, 802 to 837, placed her forever at the head of the powers of Britain. Egbert's first exploit as king was the conquest of Cornwall, the last fragment of the British kingdom in the southwest. In 825 the king of Mercia invaded Egbert's territory, but at the battle which was fought at Ellendum, the West Saxons were victorious. This victory confirmed to Egbert all of England south of the Thames, and also encouraged the East Anglians to revolt against the king of Mercia. The East Anglians were victorious in 2 great battles, and this in turn so weakened the king of Mercia as to encourage Egbert to venture even across the Thames in an invasion of Mercia. This he did in 827, and the realm of Penda and Offa bowed without a struggle to its conqueror. But Egbert did not stop with the conquest of Mercia. He marched on toward the north. Northumbria had but lately been terrorized by an invasion of Danes, and unable to resist them alone, its thanes met Egbert in Derbyshire and owned the supremacy of Wessex, and with the submission of Northumbria, the work which Oswu and Ethelred had failed to do was done, and the whole English race was for the first time knit together under a single rule. This Danish invasion of Northumbria was but a part of that great movement of the Danes in this century which reached even to France and created Normandy, and it continued in Britain until it had covered practically the whole of the land occupied by the English. Egbert defeated one host of them which invaded the land from Ireland, which gave them a check until after his death in 839. He was succeeded immediately by his son, Athelwulf. The Danes came again and were beaten off only by years of hard fighting. But a final victory at Aclea in 851 won peace for the land through the short and uneventful reigns of his sons Athelbald and Athelbert. But the northern storm burst in full force upon England when a third son, Athelred, followed his brothers on the throne. The Northmen were now settled on the coast of Ireland and the coast of Gaul. They were masters of the sea, and from west and east alike they closed upon Britain. While one host from Ireland fell on the Scot kingdom north of the Firth of Forth, another from Scandinavia landed in 866 on the coast of East Anglia under Hubba, and marched the next year upon York. A victory over two claimants of the crown gave the pirates Northumbria, and their two armies united at Nottingham in 868 for an attack on the Mercian realm. Mercia was saved by a march of King Athelred to Nottingham, but the peace which he made there with the Northmen left them leisure to prepare for an invasion of East Anglia, whose undertaking Edmund, brought prisoner before their leaders, was bound to a tree and shot to death with arrows. With him ended the line of East Anglian underkings, for his kingdom was not only conquered, but divided among the soldiers of the pirate host, and their leader, Guthrum, assumed its crown. By these victories of the Danes, the power of Wessex north of the Thames was again absolutely destroyed, and the loss of the subject kingdoms left Wessex face to face with the invaders. The time had now come for it to fight, not for supremacy, but for life. As yet the land seemed paralyzed by terror. With the exception of his one march on Nottingham, King Athelred had done nothing to save his under-kingdoms from the wreck. But the pirates no sooner pushed up the Thames to Reading in 871 than the West Saxons, attacked on their own soil, turned fiercely at bay. A desperate attack drove the Northmen from Ashdown on the heights that overlooked the Vale of Whitehorse, but their camp in the tongue of land between the Canute and Thames proved impregnable. Athelred died in the midst of the struggle, and his brother Alfred, who now became king, bought the withdrawal of the pirates and a few years' breathing space for his realm. It was easy for the quick eye of Alfred to see that the Northmen had withdrawn simply with the view of gaining firmer footing for a new attack. 3 years indeed had hardly passed before Mercia was invaded and its under-king driven over sea to make place for a tributary of the invaders. From Repton half their host marched northward to the Tyne, while Guthrum led the rest into his kingdom of East Anglia to prepare for the next year's attack on Wessex. From 874 and onward, Northumbria and Mercia had been brought wholly under the power of the Danes. In 877, Alfred defeated one main portion of their host in his region and forced the surrender of another. In their surrender, they bound themselves by an oath to leave Wessex, which they did. But the arrival of a new horde of their kinsmen caused them to forget their oath, and at the beginning of 878, the whole double host again marched ravaging over the land. The surprise of Wessex was complete, and for a month or two the general panic left no hope of resistance. Alfred, with his small band of followers, could only throw himself into a fort raised hastily in the Isle of Athelney among the marshes of Perrot, a position from which he could watch closely the position of his foes. But with the first burst of spring, he called the Thanes of Somerset to his standard, and still gathering troops as he moved, marched through Wiltshire on the Northmen. he found their host at Edington, defeated it in a great battle, and after a siege of 14 days forced them to surrender and to bind themselves by a solemn peace, or frith, at Wedmore in Somerset. In form, the Peace of Wedmore seemed a surrender of the bulk of Britain to its invaders. All Northumbria, all East Anglia, all central England east of a line which stretched from the Thames mouth along the Lee to Bedford, thence along the Ouse to Watling Street, and by Watling Street to Chester, was left subject to the Northmen. Throughout this Danelaw, as it was called, the conquerors settled down among the conquered population as lords of the soil, thickly in northern Britain, but more thinly in its central districts, but everywhere guarding jealously their old isolation and gathering in separate heers or armies round towns which were only linked in close confederacies. The peace had, in fact, saved little more than Wessex itself, but in saving Wessex, it saved England. The spell of terror was broken, the tide of invasion turned. From an attitude of attack, the Northmen were thrown back on an attitude of defense. The whole reign of Alfred was preparation for a fresh struggle that was to wrest back from the pirates the land they had won. This peace continued till 893, during which time Alfred continually strengthened the defenses of his kingdom. He built a strong fleet and gathered all the freemen of his realm into an organized force. He had a son and a daughter, Edward and Athelflaed, who both grew up to be efficient warriors. Athelflaed was married to Athelred, an alderman of the old royal stock, who also was an able warrior. This gave to Alfred 3 strong supporters in the building up of his power of defense against the Danes. Athelflaed and Athelred, her husband, were made lord and lady of Alfred's portion of Mercia. When in 893 there was a new invasion of the land by the Danes, both by land and by sea, Alfred met their fleet and held it at bay, while Edward and Athelred caught their army near the Severn and overthrew it with a vast slaughter at Buddington. And Alfred was able so well to hold his own that in 897 the latest invaders withdrew, and the Danes, who had dwelt in the land, renewed the peace which continued for 13 years. Alfred died in 901 and was succeeded by his son Edward. In 910 there was a new outbreak of the Danes inhabiting England. Athelred, the lord of Mercia, was also now dead, which left Athelflaed the ruler of Mercia. She took the field and was so successful everywhere that she won back all that had composed the full kingdom of Mercia. Edward, on his part, repulsed an inroad of another new band of Danes and brought East Anglia under his power. Athelflaed died in 918. Edward immediately annexed Mercia to his dominion and carried his arms triumphantly to the Humber. And in 924 the whole of the north suddenly laid itself at his feet. Not merely Northumbria, but the Scots and the Britons of Strathclyde chose him to father and lord. Edward the Unconquered died in 925 and was succeeded by his son Athelstan till 940, when he died and was succeeded by his son Edmund till 946, when he was killed by a robber and was succeeded by his brother Edred. Under Athelstan, Northumberland was incorporated, and the immediate realm of the one king of England reached to the 4th. Still, both he and his 2 successors had to fight against endless revolts and rival kings in Northumberland. The Danish land was won and lost and won back over and over again, till at last under Edred Northumberland was finally incorporated and ruled, sometimes by a single earl, sometimes by 2 of the king's appointment. With its submission in 954 the work of conquest was done. Dogged as his fight had been, the Northman at last owned himself beaten. From the moment of Edred's final triumph, all resistance came to an end. The Kingdom of England was now formed. The first half of the 10th century thus gave the West Saxon kings a position in Britain such as no English kings of any kingdom had ever held before them. Dominant in their own island, claiming and, whenever they could, exercising a supremacy over the other princes of the island, their position in the island world of Britain was analogous to the position of the Western emperors in continental Europe. It was, in fact, an imperial position. As such, it was marked by the assumption of the imperial title Monarcha, Imperator, Basileus, Augustus, and even Caesar. These titles were meant at once to assert the imperial supremacy of the English kings within their own world, and to deny any supremacy over Britain on the part of either of the lords of the continental world. But one and strong and glorious as England stood in the central years of the 10th century, her unity and strength and glory were bought in no small degree by the loss of the ancient freedom of her people. In 955, Edred died and was succeeded by the two sons of his brother and predecessor, Edmund. The elder son, Edwig, received Wessex as King of England by right, while the younger, Edgar, received Northumberland and Mercia as under-king to Edwig. But in 957 the kingdom was actually divided into these two parts by the Mercians and Northumbrians, declaring Edgar full king in his own right. However, in 959 Edwig died, and Edgar succeeded to the whole dominion in his own right, and under Edgar's rule the land enjoyed 16 years of unparalleled peace and of unparalleled prosperity. During his reign, no word of foreign invasion was breathed, and the 2 or 3 disturbances within the island were of slight consequence. At no time in our early history did England hold a higher position in the world in general. And when old Saxon Otto wore the crown of Rome, and West Saxon Edgar, in some sort his nephew, reigned over the island empire of Britain, the Saxon name had reached the highest point of its glory. Edgar was succeeded by his son Edward in 975, but he was allowed to reign only 4 years, for at the instigation of his stepmother, Alfthryth, he was murdered in 979, and Alfthryth's son, Athelred II, was put upon the throne, and thus entered on the saddest and most shameful reign in English annals, which continued for 37 years. In the 2nd year of his reign, 980, another invasion of the Danes flooded the land, and the flood never really ceased until all England was held by the Danes, and a Dane sat upon the throne of all England. The unready king, that is, the king without reed or counsel, seems to have been incapable of any settled or vigorous plan of action. He showed energy now and then in needless and fruitless enterprises, but under him the kingdom never showed a united front toward the common enemy. His only policy of his cowardly or traitorous advisers, was the self-destroying policy of buying off the invaders with money. The invaders are met at London, at Malden, at Exeter with the highest valor and conduct on the part of the leaders and people of particular cities and districts, but it is always isolated cities and districts which resist. Such local efforts were naturally fruitless. The local force is either defeated by superior numbers, or, if victorious, it has, through want of concert with other parts of the kingdom, no means of following up its victory. Through a warfare like this, carried on year after year, the nation at last lost heart as well as its king. Local jealousies, hushed under the vigorous rule of earlier kings, now rose again. It is emphatically said that one shire would not help other. Under such a reign the efforts of the best men in the land were thwarted, and the places of highest power fell to the worst men. The successive advisers of Athelred appear as a succession of traitors who sold him and his kingdom to the enemy. It was for the witan to pass decrees, but it was for the king to put them in force, and under Athelred nothing good was ever put in force. In 991 a new wave of the Danish flood swept upon the land. However, by this time they were more than Danes who came. Even the Norwegian king, Olaf Tryggvason, was amongst them. In 994 another wave swept upon the devoted land. In this the Northman hosts were led by King Olaf of Norway and King Sweyn of Denmark. The forces of London defeated those that invaded that part of the land, but Athelred obtained peace from them by purchase with money. Yet the peace was not kept, except by a portion of them, and for 8 years the war went on by new invasions on the part of the Danes, and new payments on the part of the king, until 1002, when an attempt was made to rid England of the Danes by a general massacre on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November. Athelred had also quarreled with Duke Richard of Normandy, but in this same year, 1002, he sealed a peace with Richard, and also hoped to strengthen his kingdom by receiving in marriage Emma, the daughter of Duke Richard of Normandy. Wedding and murder, however, proved feeble defenses against Sweyn. His fleet reached the coast in 1003, and for 4 years he marched through the length and breadth of southern and eastern England, lighting his war beacons as he went in blazing homestead and town. Then for a heavy bribe he withdrew, to prepare for a later and more terrible onset. But there was no rest for the realm. The fiercest of the Norwegian Churls took his place, and from Wessex the war extended over Mercia and East Anglia. Sweyn returned in 1013. The war was terrible but short. Everywhere the country was pitilessly harried, churches plundered, men slaughtered. With the one exception of London, there was no attempt at resistance. Oxford and Winchester flung open their gates. The Thanes of Wessex submitted to the Northmen at Bath. Even London was forced at last to give way, and Athelred fled over sea to a refuge in Normandy. The Danish king was acknowledged as king, though native writers choose rather to call him tyrant over all England. Sweyn died in 1014 and was succeeded by his son Canute, a young man of 19. The English council, or witan, however, called for the restoration of Athelred. Athelred returned, which caused a war between the two kings. In 1016 Athelred died and was succeeded by his son Edmund, surnamed Ironside, an able general who was successful against Canute until Aldermen Edric of Mercia's deserting him in the midst of a great battle at Assendon caused his complete overthrow. The kingdom was then divided between Edmund and Canute, Edmund taking the south and Canute the north. But Edmund died shortly afterward, and Canute, both by his power and by formal election, became king of all England, was regularly crowned as such, and ruled even as a native king. England was neither oppressed nor degraded under his rule. His government, his laws were framed after the pattern of those of the ancient kings. He sent home his Danish army, keeping only a body of chosen guards, the famous Housecarls. These were the first standing army known in England, a body of picked men, Danes, Englishmen, or brave men from any quarter. Canute gradually displaced the Danes whom he had at first placed in high offices, and gave them English successors. He raised an Englishman, the renowned Godwin, to a place second only to kingship, with the new title of Earl of the West Saxons. In her foreign relations, England, under her Danish king, was in no sense a dependency of Denmark. England was the center, Winchester was the imperial city of a northern empire which rivaled those of the east and the west. Canute, it must be remembered, was chosen to the crown of England first of all, while still very young. To that crown he added the crown of Denmark, on the death or deposition of his brother Harold. He won Norway, which had revolted against his father, from its king Olaf, and he seems to have established his power over part of Sweden and other parts of the Baltic lands. But all these were acquisitions made by one who was already king of all England. They were largely won by English valor, and the complaint in Denmark and elsewhere was that Canute made his northern kingdom subordinate to England, and preferred Englishmen rather than natives to high offices in them. At home, after the first years of his reign, his rule was one of perfect peace. In 1028 he wrote, "I have vowed to God to lead a right life in all things, to rule justly and piously my realms and subjects, and to administer just judgment to all. If heretofore I have done aught beyond what was just, through headiness or negligence of youth, I am ready with God's help to amend it utterly. No royal officer, either for fear of the king or for favor of any, is to consent to injustice. None is to do wrong to rich or poor as they would value my friendship and their own well-being. I have no need that money be heaped together for me by unjust demands. I have sent this letter before me that all the people of my realm may rejoice in my well-doing. For as you yourselves know, never have I spared nor will I spare to spend myself and my toil in what is needful and good for my people." In 1031, Canute's reign over all the north was made complete by the Scotch kings doing full homage to the King of all England. Canute died in 1035. He had named as his successor in England Harthacnut or Hardicanute, his son by Emma, the widow of Athelred, whom early in his reign he had married, though she must have been nearly twice as old as he. But there was another son named Harold, who was supported in his claims to the kingdom by Mercia and Northumberland. The West Saxons, with Godwin and Emma, in accordance with Canute's will, accepted Harthacnut. War was prevented by a decree of the National Council dividing the kingdom between the two. Harthacnut remained in Denmark, and the West Saxons deposed him and acknowledged Harold. There came also over from Normandy Alfred, the elder son of Athelred, who in 1016 had been obliged to flee the kingdom from the jealous hate of Canute. But his attempt was a complete failure. He and his companions fell into the hands of Harold. His companions were all put to death. He himself was blinded, and soon afterward he died. In 1040 Harold himself died, and Harthacnut, by right and by national choice, became king again, this time king of the whole realm. But his reign was now short, for he died in 1042. The English nation then chose Edward, the second son of Athelred, who had fled to Normandy. His monastic virtues won him the reputation of a saint and the title of the Confessor. But no man could have been less fitted to wear the crown of England in such an age. It was chiefly by the influence of Godwin that Edward had been chosen to the kingship, and Edward now married Godwin's daughter, and did him further honor by appointing his sons to earldoms. Edward greatly offended the English people by bringing with him from Normandy, and putting into every place that he could, a great number of Norman favorites. His chief favorite was a Norman monk whom he made first Bishop of London, and presently Archbishop of Canterbury. These Norman favorites soon made themselves so insolent and unbearable that Godwin and his sons, in behalf of the nation, took up arms against them. But Godwin was induced to submit his cause to the National Council, which decided against him, and he and his sons were banished. But within a year, 1050, they returned with an army. The English were now so utterly wearied with the arrogance of the king's Norman favorites that they gladly welcomed Godwin. The king mustered an army to meet him, but the army refused to fight. The National Assembly again considered Godwin's cause, and banished the Norman Archbishop of Canterbury with a great company of other Normans. In 1053 the great Earl Godwin died, and was succeeded in his high place in the kingdom by his son Harold. In the beginning of 1066, King Edward died while the National Assembly was in session. Edward had no children, and on his deathbed he had recommended Harold as his successor. The National Assembly accepted the recommendation, and Harold was regularly chosen and crowned King of England and reigned as Harold II. The Norman Invasion. In 1035 the death of Duke Robert of Normandy had left his son William his successor, a child of but 7 or 8 years old. He was the 6th Duke of Normandy, and by relationship was the 5th in direct descent from Rolf, or Rollo, the Danish chief who received from Charles the Simple the Duchy of Normandy. By the time that he attained to the age of 20, he had firmly fixed his authority in Normandy, and by the time he was 36, he had obtained possession of the counties of Maine and Brittany, and stood first among the princes of France. In 1051, he had made a visit to King Edward of England, and ever afterward claimed that at that time Edward had promised to him the crown of England at Edward's death. He further claimed that while Edward was a child in banishment in Normandy, he had said to William that if ever he became King of England, William should be his successor. Further, about 1065, when Harold was the foremost subject in England, he had made a journey to Normandy, but by a storm was driven out of his direct course and was shipwrecked near the mouth of the Somme, in the territory of the Count of Ponthieu, who would not let him go without a ransom, and William paid the ransom, and so Harold came safely to William's court. William told him of the promise that Edward had made and asked Harold whether he would support him in his claims under the promise. Harold assented, but William asked for an oath. This too Harold gave. And now, in 1066, when William learned that Harold himself had received the crown of England, without any recognition or even mention of any of his claims, he determined that he would have the kingdom anyhow. He first sent an envoy to Rome to obtain the sanction of the Pope. When William had taken the oath of Harold to support him in his claims to the kingship of England under the promises of Edward, by a trick he had secured Harold's oath upon the relics of the saints. And now, when he desired the Pope's sanction of his enterprise, he urged the perjury and the awful blasphemy of Harold's course in disregarding an oath given upon the holy relics. He asked the Pope even to put all England under an interdict because of her having chosen such a man as this for king, and also because the nation had expelled the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had borne the consecration of Rome. Hildebrand was at that time archdeacon at the papal court. He approved William's claims, and by his influence the Pope also was brought to William's support. William was thus able to cloak his schemes under the guide of a crusade and to attack England alike with temporal and spiritual weapons. Feeling thus sure of his ground in the support of the papacy, William issued a proclamation that, supported by the Holy Father of Christendom, who had sent to him a consecrated banner, William, Duke of Normandy, was about to demand by force of arms his rightful inheritance of England, and that all who would serve him with spear, sword, or crossbow should be amply rewarded. At this call gathered together all the adventurers of Western Europe. They came in crowds from Maine and Anjou, from Poitou and Brittany, from Aquitaine and Burgundy, from France and Flanders. They should have land, they should have money, they should wed Saxon heiresses, the humblest foot soldier should be a gentleman. The summer of 1066 was almost past before the preparations were complete. A large fleet had assembled at the beginning of September at the mouth of the Dive. At this same time there was hanging over England another invasion from Norway. The King of Norway in this same month of September landed with a host in what is now Yorkshire, defeated the local forces, and September 24 received the submission of the territory immediately north of the Humber. Harold, marching to meet the invaders, found them September 25 and routed them at Stamford Bridge, near the city of York. In the afternoon of September 27, William, at the head of his fleet, started across the Channel, and early in the day, September 28, landed at Pevensey, on the coast of Sussex. Harold, learning of this, brought his army as rapidly as possible again to the south, and October 14, with his forces of Wessex, East Anglia and Mercia, met William and his host on the hill of Senlac, near the city of Hastings, and not a great distance from the place of his landing. At 9 o'clock, the Normans moved across the little valley with the papal banner carried in advance of the Duke. The camp of the English was fortified by a trench and a stockade, and at first the English were successful. They repulsed both the Norman horsemen and footmen, and at one time there was such danger of a panic amongst the Normans that William was obliged to tear off his helmet so that he could be readily recognized and by voice rally his troops. After a fight of 6 hours, William commanded his men to turn their backs. The English raised